As we begin our discussion of the geographies of American literature, I want to kind of open with a sense of the spaces of elegy in American poetry, and how two different writers who are more than 75 years apart kind of look at very serious kind of reflective spaces in the context of poems that are both have historical and perhaps racial dimensions to them. We're looking at Alan Tate's Ode to the Confederate Dead and Tate Marshall's Picking Flowers this week. So take a look at the two poems, and as you read, kind of think about the elegiac impulse that's present within both poems, that both are kind of serious reflections and are thinking about the past and loss and mortality, but are using very different kinds of spaces in which to kind of transact that sense of loss. American poetry overall, seems to have, often seems to have an elegiac impulse to it, right? That there's something that's been lost. There's some past innocence there that, the poet is trying to call back up, or is trying to remember, or trying to recover in some way. And so you can kind of think here about what's been lost in these poets' imaginations, what's disappeared, who's died, and how those losses affect the ways in which they try to put together a contemporary present. This is the kind of thing that we'll be thinking about in terms of the Mississippis that we get from William Faulkner and from Jesmond Ward in the novels that we'll look at in the coming weeks. As you read these poems, kind of think about the writer's dispositions to that sense of loss. Are those is that sense of loss located deep in the past, perhaps, or is it very close to the writer and a very real present in each case here? Also note the spaces that kind of get invoked throughout the poems. Tate kind of gives you a catalog of Civil War battles in his poem as he reflects on this cemetery of Confederate dead. And Marshall himself is kind of moving through urban spaces, kind of perhaps reflecting on gang violence on Chicago's South Side as well. Another kind of space that you might think of in each poem is a sense of turf, and the sense of turf, especially in the sense of ground for which blood has been spilled, what's been sacrificed to maintain these spaces, or to set up these spaces in each poem. With Tate's Ode to the Confederate Dead, you've got the space of a cemetery, and Tate unravels it in very kind of distinct and regular language. The sense of the row after row of the headstones gathered with the names scratched, that are standing against time and change, and so you have the poem reflecting on that space of loss and mortality. This goes through the end of the poem, which ends with the injunction to leave now, the shut gate and the decomposing wall. So how does the figure in the poem come to grips with mortality or not by the end of the poem is something worth considering in your reflections on it. You also have an autumnal setting in the poem, that there's, you have the wind and the falling leaves of November there. The wind whirs without recollection, going into winter and the season of loss. And Tate will talk the cursing only the leaves, crying like an old man in a storm. So you get the leaves of autumn, falling, but also leaves in the sense of all the kinds of collected papers that have been written on in remembering the dead, and that those cry out, but do they really recollect and make sense of the loss there? In the end, there's a lot of silence in this poem. For Tate, the silence of natural elements and stone that mark the cemetery, the silence which smothers you, the poem calls up, or the brute curiosity of an angel's stare turns you like them to stone. So you have this kind of silence that's that's both figured in the visual elements of the poem and a sense of silence that kind of wells up beneath or within the figure at the cemetery. You could think of some of the traditional kinds of figures that the ode uses here, right? What shall we say of the bones? The bones in the cemetery, and we'll come back to more bones in Jesmond Ward's novel, a sense of loss and how you live with it, or how you make sense of it, or how loss itself makes sense of spaces in American experience. Tate calls up and asks, think of the autumns that have come and gone. So the passage of time and how that passage of time marks our own sense of mortality here. And then very kind of distinct, figures that appear in a sense of a poem reflecting on mortality, the ravenous grave and the gentle serpent at the end of the poem. The traditional kinds of biblical figures that appear in the poem that invoke a sense of loss and of mortality. You can compare the figures in Tate's poem to Tate Marshall's great Picking Flowers from his recent edition of poems called The Wild Hundreds. In Marshall's poem, he's working through urban spaces. So you get the kind of very regular and real space of Mrs. Bradley's yard and the unfamiliar bloom that's in it. Or the speaker within the poem who says, I'm on the express train passing stops to a woman. So he's on his way to a woman he has at least has a crush on. And so very kind of regular, real urban spaces in the speaker's experience in Marshall's poem. There's a play between the urban and natural worlds within this poem as well. So he builds points of comparison between the visual images that he brings into the poem and urban experience. For instance, Grandma's rose bush is reminiscent of a vice lord's do-rag. So he invokes a sense of gang colors and the kind of real stuff, both natural and human, that marks an experience of the city. He later in the poem he writes, a bouquet in my hand, brilliant, a gang war wrapped and cut. So again, the colors, the gang colors, and that he is carrying across the city on his way to see a woman. And the narrator's presence here is very important too, right? That we didn't ever get an I who was speaking specifically as an I in Tate's poem, but in Marshall's poem we have the I with a small I. I'm on the express train. I have a bouquet in my hand. So, how does Marshall's sense of including this I in the poem impact your sense of experience of loss and the I's sense of mortality here? It's kind of a great logic that develops within Picking Flowers here. In the middle of the poem, working towards the end, Marshall writes, a man carries flowers for 3 reasons. He is in love, he is in mourning, he is a flower salesman. And then at the end, I am not a flower salesman. That is the only thing I know. So you have this great sense of, is the speaker saying that he's in love, or is he speaking of the fact that he's also perhaps in mourning as well? So the mourning of urban experience, of loss of those he loves, but also a sense of trying to stand against that sense of loss by developing love for this woman that he's traveling towards. So you get in these 2 poems, you get this kind of great sense of writers working with a sense of loss and traveling and engaging spaces that push your sense of how the writers are dealing with the very real kind of human experience of mortality and loss, and finding spaces in which to transact or come to grips with that sense of loss. I look forward to hearing your reflections on the poems as well. Thanks.